Welcome to the Lizzie Borden Podcast, episode 36. I am your host, Stephanie Corey, filling in for the late Richard Behrens, author of the Lizzie Borden Girl Detective series of mysteries. The Lizzie Borden Podcast is the only podcast entirely devoted to the study of the Borden murders of 1892, Lizzie Borden, the history of her hometown Fall River, Massachusetts, and sometimes subjects relating to 19th century New England. Produced by Nine Muses Books and Anna Behrens. Each episode explores some aspect of the mystery that is Lizzie Borden, from the origins of the doggerel Lizzie Borden Took an Axe to a primer on the case by noted authors and experts, including dramatic readings of Richard Behrens' Lizzie Borden Girl Detective Mystery Series. In this episode, we're turning our attention to the town of Webster, Massachusetts, and a truly immersive museum experience that brings the past to life in a remarkable way. We talk with Barbara Van Reed, who is the executive director of the Samuel Slater Experience, and Nicole Gaudette, the museum's program coordinator. And now, the Lizzie Borden Podcast presents an interview with Barbara Van Reed and Nicole Gaudette. Welcome to the Lizzie Borden Podcast. Today, we're turning our attention to the town of Webster, Massachusetts, and a truly immersive museum experience that brings the past to life in a remarkable way. The Samuel Slater Experience is a state-of-the-art, interactive museum that tells the story of America's Industrial Revolution through the eyes of Samuel Slater, a pioneering figure in the textile industry who transformed Webster into a thriving mill town in the early 19th century. Housed in the National Guard Armory building, the museum combines traditional exhibits with cutting-edge technology, including life-size dioramas, soundscapes, and digital storytelling, to transport visitors back to the 1800s. Whether you're a history buff, a teacher looking for an educational field trip, or simply someone curious about how industry shaped the New England we know today, the Samuel Slater Experience offers something for everyone. Joining me today are two incredible women who helped bring that experience to life. Before we dive into our conversation, let me introduce them properly. Barbara Van Reed has been with the Samuel Slater Experience for 5 years, serving as the executive director since it opened 3 years ago. Prior to that, she was the publisher and editor of a local business newspaper with 4 monthly editions. Barbara also had a variety of positions in high tech, in international marketing, federal marketing, and product management. And Nicole Gaudette is the museum program coordinator at the Samuel Slater Experience. She graduated from Simmons University with a Master's of Library Science and has a background in art history. Nicole has lived in Washington, D.C. and New York City, both museum-rich cities, but has recently moved back to central Massachusetts where she grew up. Museums and history have always been a subject close to her. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, Nicole is a woman after my own heart. I have a Master of Library Science as well, so
Great.
Fellow librarians unite, right? It's good that you have a really impressive job with a library degree. That's really great.
Thank you.
And not a traditional library job, so fabulous. So the first question is about the museum itself. So the Samuel Slater Experience is, to me, a gem of a museum in Webster, Mass. Before we delve into the story of who the museum is about, could you kind of share with our listeners the genesis of such a unique historical museum? I'm particularly intrigued by the attention to the user experience this museum offers. It's so well done that you don't refer to yourselves as a museum, rather you call yourselves an experience. Can you tell us how this came to be, either one of you or both?
Well, there are a couple of parts to this answer. I want to start by saying that usually the names of towns in Massachusetts are named after their founder. So we have Dudley, Douglas. I mean, there were people who these towns are named after. In the case of Webster, that's not so. The town is actually named after Daniel Webster by Samuel Slater. So because of that, most people who live in Webster were unaware of Slater and his role in the town, in the formation of it. And you'll find many Webster people have no idea that Samuel Slater is actually buried in Webster.
Oh.
So he's still there, kind of. And many of his family members are there as well. How it came to be, the museum itself, is that about 7-8 years ago, one of the a Webster resident, was building a restaurant, upscale restaurant in Webster, and it had to be named. His daughter named it Samuel Slater's Restaurant. The funder said, "Who is Samuel Slater?" And she said, "Well, he's the founder of Webster." And his response was, "We have to do something about that." And the something to do about that was build a museum for him. And the search began to find an old Slater mill along the river, the French River, or a suitable building. It was hard to do. There was none. Most of the mills, as in many Massachusetts towns, the old mills are not renovatable. He finally found the National Guard Armory, which belonged to the town, and which he rented for $1 a year for 30 years. And then the actual work on the museum began. Now, the founder, his name is Christopher Robert, believes in his heart that museums are boring. And he says, "I do not want to do boring." He says, "I know kids can't stand it. Their heads are in screens all the time. And so we have to make this interactive, engaging, intriguing to students." So from the beginning, the design and the purpose was to make it accessible to students. It so happens that in Massachusetts, the curriculum framework teaches 5th graders about the Industrial Revolution. So that's kind of who the audience is. But like you said in the beginning, there are lots of artifacts. And, we have text panels too. So yeah, we have all interaction, but you can also visit in the traditional way and stand and read and delve into it that way. So whether you're a kid or a history buff, whether you're from far or near, it works for everyone. Well, the development was going on. We were referring to it as the Samuel Slater Museum, but decided eventually that was not the way to sell it, basically. People today are no longer buying things. They're actually investing in experiences. So it seemed a word that's apropos to the culture today. And so we called it Samuel Slater Experience.
And it is an experience, correct? Because you actually get wet at one point if you're in.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I've not yet met a person who's visited who hasn't been truly impressed by all of that. Okay, Nicole, you want to add to that?
Yes, I just want to touch a little more on the immersive, interactive element. And I think that's something that we do that's really on the cutting edge of how you create a museum now. Because even if, we're the experience, and I think we really try to embody that in our programming and what we kind of try and offer our guests. But at the same time, there's still that little element of, we are a museum, but we're trying to make museums as something more accessible, as Barbara said. To me, if we could get some of the kids that come through here to realize, hey, I actually like museums, or I love museums, I love history, I want to, as I continue my education or as I continue schooling, I'd like to look more into this and explore this field more. I think that would be like the best outcome that we could have.
Nicole, that makes me think of a visit that we had some time ago, and there was a boy maybe 10, 12 years old, and he came out and said, "Boy, this is the best museum I've ever been to." And I'm thinking, like, how many museums have you been to in your life, But he was duly impressed at a young age.
Massachusetts has a lot of museum experiences to offer, and this one seems unique in many regards, not only because of the interactivity, because children's museums sometimes have a lot of that, but it seems like it's so historically based and it's so informative of a way of life that is no more, that it's kind of awe-inspiring. It's like, oh, that's what it was like to live back then, and oh, that's what it was like to be on a ship and come to America. And yeah, so you get a sense of a deep sense, I think, of historical significance of the man and the era and the importance of the Industrial Revolution in this area. And I didn't know Slater was buried in Webster. That's amazing.
The other thing is that the technology here is used to propel the story. It's not there to be an end of it into itself, like in some children's museums where the interactivity is the point. Here it's not. Here it's the mechanism to advance the story.
Well, Webster in its heyday was like a summer resort destination for the rich in the past. And you have a city street full of shops in your museum as they appeared about 100 years ago, as well as vehicles of the time period, including a simulated ride on a vintage streetcar. So tell us about how the town grew around the Slater Mills and nearby Webster Lake, which I don't think it's really called Webster Lake, but that's the short version of it, right?
Nicole and I will be able to tell you the long version. In any case, the museum is divided into two parts, and which you have basically described. First is the actual the historical Slater coming to Webster, and then we fast forward 100 years to show you what Webster was like then. So the result of the investments in mills that Slater had made, it produced a thriving community. I think that you mentioned already, but kind of the heart of it was that there's a lake, a large lake. In fact, the largest regular lake pond in the state of Massachusetts. So that helped make it a destination. In fact, the lake was the first place that Slater dammed up. But when he came to Webster in 1811, everything was farming. And so people had to come from the countryside, and he had to build them houses and so on. They had to have housing. He had to make stores. He had to basically make a village. It became a mill village, and it grew and grew because he ended up having 3 very large mill complexes in Webster, in what would become Webster. So the infrastructure had to be there as well. And then the lake was there, bringing people from New York and from Boston to play. Well, there are many mill villages in Massachusetts. Most of them don't have all the, like you say, all the shopping and all the a lot of entertainment. Apparently, at one point there were like 21 saloons there, so it was definitely a destination. So it was 100 years after Slater came, it was thriving.
So is the Webster Lake? Is it a great pond?
Yes.
Okay, because Fall River has a great pond, the Watuppa, which is the water supply, the drinking water supply for the community in the area. Is Webster Lake a water supply?
No.
So how do you pronounce Webster Lake?
So it's Lake Charaganga, Manchagagog, Chabanga Gangamog.
What?
That's the full name. And it's actually the 3rd longest place name in the world. Interesting.
Beyond
so
anything
I think it's
in
the
Wales?
longest place name in the continuous United States.
Wow.
I don't know for sure, but I think Iceland and Wales just beat it out. The interesting story about that is that it's also a more modern invention. So Webster Lake, as the name, is something that came about, well after the town was named Webster. People started coming here on vacation. But Lake Charaganga, Manchagagog, Chabanga Gangamog is also a name that has 20th century roots. So I believe, or 19th century. I don't know if you know exactly, Barbara. It was a name that was fabricated by an editor of the Webster Times.
Oh, it's not like Native American or something original.
The root of it is Chabanagangamog was actually the way it was written. That was the way the Nipmuc Indians, the tribe here then, named it. And that's how it first appears on Webster maps back in the 1800s.
Oh, okay. So it doesn't appear as a shortened version. That was the original name.
But it's interesting that there are there were regular Nipmuc, there's Nipmuc words, because the second part of it, Manchog, there's actually a town next to us, a part of Sutton, which is called manchog. So these were common Indian words.
Okay. Lost to us now, though,
Yeah,
are they people's names or are they mean something? Like Great Pond.
they have to do with fishing.
Oh, okay. So the kind of fish that's inside too in the
Oh,
pond.
location of fishing, or the best translation is neutral fishing ground.
I'm
But for but
fascinated
for
by that.
but for fun, people call it you fish on your side, I fish on my side. No one fishes in the middle.
That's what it
But that's
means.
really not accurate.
Oh, okay.
That's just for fun.
That's great. By attending the Slater experience, one can have an up close and personal understanding of not only the town of Webster and its heyday, but they can learn about the life of Samuel Slater, which is the Slater experience. So, can you tell us about Slater, who has been named the father of the Industrial Revolution in America?
Yeah, so Samuel Slater, he's in the history books. He's known as the father of the American Industrial Revolution, sometimes as the father of American manufacturing. And the reason for that is that he brought a specific kind of mill operations to the colonies, to America, the newly formed country. And the setting for it is really important in that in 1789, which is the year that the Constitution was ratified, it was the year George Washington was inaugurated as president. There wasn't any love lost between Britain and the colonies. Britain was the textile empire of the world. They had the best cloth in the world, so they had the best sails and they said the best navy. So they ruled. And the last thing they wanted was the colonies to have that technology. So they insisted that America should buy their goods. And to try to ensure that, England had a law that you could not transfer technology, that anyone who brought that technology to the colonies could be deemed a traitor. So just as an aside on that, and I'm going to let Nicole tell the rest of the story, but you have to set this in the world of international trade. And so that was an issue then, just like it is now. And throughout visiting the museum, you'll see parallels, topics that occurred then, like immigration is another one. There were issues then, just there are now. So it's fascinating, I think, to go back and forth and to see how things are still, I would not say not the same, but the same kinds of fundamental issues still exist today in our history today.
Yeah, it's very true.
Okay, you tell the rest of the story.
Well, so Britain was this powerhouse in textile production, and Samuel Slater grew up in England, and he was an apprentice for 7-8 years at a cotton textile mill in England. And that's where he learned the ins and outs of the industry. And he was actually, as part of his apprenticeship, he was responsible for overseeing the construction of a new mill for his mill overseer, Jedediah Strutt. And I think that experience of being closely involved in building a new mill for his master really cemented in his mind and gave him the ability to bring that information here.
So steal that information and bring it here.
Yes, right? Steal that information. As Barbara said, Britain, they were very successful, and they wanted to keep that information to the benefit of British citizens. And the brand new United States were no longer British citizens. So why should, they get to benefit from this British technology? Samuel Slater obviously did not have that same belief because he emigrated to this country, and he brought, just in his memory, he was able to hold the blueprints, the diagrams, the plans. So there is no kind of papers that he brought with him. It was all in his head. And he also brought the larger style of how to manage a mill. So he was very ambitious. He was obviously very bright. He was super smart. But I think importantly, he wasn't necessarily an inventor himself, but he was just an amazingly shrewd businessman who knew how to manage and make business decisions. But while he had a very developed mechanical mind, in order to replicate the machinery, he didn't necessarily have the inventiveness of developing the machinery himself.
So we're talking about the power loom, or we're talking about which machinery in particular? Do you know?
So this would be
invented.
the water wheel power system,
Okay.
and the spinning frames.
Spinning frames. Okay. So he not only like a month after he gets out of his indenture apprenticeship, he like gets on a boat, right? And he comes to the United States and he brings with him his apprenticeship papers around his neck underneath his clothes and pretends he's a farmer so he can emigrate without anybody asking him any questions like, what are you doing here? And he like doesn't even tell his mom and dad or his family. He just like splits. Like that's a unique individual that is definitely has dollar signs in his head, but he also sees opportunity somewhere else, and he really creates that opportunity for the United States by coming, and he comes to New York, I understand, and then Brown and who are the two from Pawtucket? Brown and
Moses Brown and Richard Elmy.
Yes, Moses Brown and Richard Olney are going to open up a new mill system or have a plan for a business, and he like writes them and says, oh, you need me because I know how that stuff works. And because he has the apprenticeship papers, he can prove it. So he moves from New York to Pawtucket, and they set up the Slater Mill, which becomes the Slater Mill. But he's the kind of guy who's like, also, not only is he ambitious and all that stuff, they're like, okay, you work for us and you give us the information and we'll build the mill and then he's like, I'm a partner or nothing. So he's a kid, like a very young man.
The value of his information.
Yeah.
He was 21.
Yeah, that's great.
Definitely a gutsy.
What an interesting
But it paid off for him in the end.
They did. They needed him, and he knew they needed him. So he was like in charge of that situation to such a degree that, and then what does he marry one of his partner's daughters, right? So if even further cementing.
Yes, when Moses Brown brought him to Rhode Island, he went to live with the Wilkinson family, and David Wilkinson was a machinist, and his father Oziel was also involved in the technology and the building. But David Wilkinson had a sister whose name is Hannah, and when Samuel Slater went to live with them and board with them, basically when he moved to Rhode Island, she was 15 years old. Mm. And he, like I just said, he was 21 at the time, but then they eventually married.
Mm-hmm. And she was an inventor in her own right. Well, he was an inventor. She invented something. So
he did.
What did she invent, and what about her invention that led to an actual patent?
She invented sewing thread.
Really?
Yes. And a way to make it that was stronger than the traditional single thread that they had been using. So she twisted it so that it would be much thicker and just had more utility. And she was able to patent that. Wow. And there's some dispute, but apparently she was the first woman to ever receive a U.S. patent.
Wow, that's cool.
If she wasn't first, she was second. Right, Nicole? I said there's some dispute. I don't think the U.S. patent.
No, she was definitely first. I believe that she was first.
Okay.
Because the dispute comes from the naming conventions of the time. The patent was listed under the name Mrs. Samuel Slater. So instead of Hannah Slater, and some people say, hey, that doesn't really count as being the first woman to hold a patent because it's her husband's name.
Oh, that's crazy.
But the other two, I guess, leaders or women who had significant patents taken out on their inventions were at much later dates.
Well, there you go.
So
Why is
Any
that
way
a
you slice
dispute?
it, she's going to
Yeah.
be the earliest one in 1793.
So this is a
And she was only
family.
19 years old at the time.
Oh, wow.
So,
So this is like a family who like knows how to get things done and how to move forward in this brand new colonial world that they are paving and making way through. And if it wasn't for Slater and his knowledge and his actual thievery, I guess, his treason. Now, in England, they still think of him as treasonous, but if it wasn't for that, then we wouldn't have towns like Fall River, and we wouldn't have towns like Lowell, and we wouldn't have towns like the fact that he took this risk is like a significant thing for the United States of America at the time. It's kind of, he needs to be taught everywhere.
yes, exactly. And that is one of, as Barbara said earlier, one of the founding principles of the museum and why the museum was formed, because it's such a huge part of our local history that not many people, even if you're, from this area, that you don't really necessarily know about.
Yeah, I've been to the Slater Mill in Pawtucket, and it's beautifully restored. It's beautiful. It's sort of idyllic, and you know in your heart that it wasn't an idyllic place at the time and the kind of work that was done, but it's just so scenic now. But the Slater Mill in Pawtucket was just the beginning of this industrial revolution. Slater was the first to really move the tasks of making thread, yarn, and cloth into a successful company. Because before that, even in an early mill in 1811 in Fall River, it was things that were done in the mill were actually farmed out or given out to farm women to complete the task of spinning the yarn or working the thread and doing those things. So it was sort of a co-op situation as opposed to a mill system, where he moved all that stuff into the same company and into the same building, and all from an act of industrial espionage, which I think is exciting. It would make a really good movie anyway. And in his native England, he's still referred to as Slater the Traitor, which I think is hilarious. And that is still his legacy there. And yet his legacy here is quite different. So imagine having two different reputations like that in your lifetime. It's kind of profound to me.
That's right. As we have a sign in the museum that says, however you think of him has to do with which side of the ocean you're on.
Yes, yes. Slater and his group proved that there was money to be made. Other pioneers started to build mills and systems, and I'm thinking of the Lowell mill system, which is called a vertically integrated system of textile production. Can you speak of how different this was than the Slater system? Because it actually is very different. And then, of course, the Fall River system is a third different system from these other two. So what about the Lowell system, which a lot of people might be familiar with?
There are several differences between like the Lowell system and the Slater system. One is in its capital structure. Cabot Lowell was an investor. There were many other investors that built the mills, and not just Lowell, but also Waltham and other places. They were basically, it was kind of the beginning of a capitalist structure. And they hired people to work in the mills. And that was as far as it went. They were paid laborers. Slater brought with him a different kind of approach to ownership and to management. First in Massachusetts, in Webster. And this was carried over from the way it was done in England, where entire families were involved in the mill. They all took part in it in some way. And Slater tried to replicate that in Rhode Island and then in Webster. And it worked very well and for him, because he basically managed everything, the entire family. And that goes right down to assuming that the family discipline structure would prevail inside a mill. And it was affected by building homes for the families, providing the store, giving them land to raise some vegetables and then maybe pasture a cow and so on. It involved Sunday school. Pretty much every aspect of their life was somehow in his control. But I said that wasn't something he invented. There was something that he took over from the tradition in England. But so part of what was happening in Webster and the Slater mills was that children worked in the mills. And we'll probably talk about child labor and all of that a little bit later on. We're talking about what was different in Lowell. In Lowell, it was mostly girls, but they were at least 14 years old, and they would work for a few years and then leave again. And they were brought in from the countryside. Now, this is true in both instances. It was mostly people who were farmers who came to work in the mills, but the ownership was different, and the actual labor was different. There were also some differences in what was being done in the mills. Slater was not the first to integrate different aspects. His initial mills had carding and spinning powered systems, but they did not include weaving. So the looms were not initially part of it, whereas in Lowell it was. So in that way, Lowell was more integrated, being able to provide more of from the raw materials down to the finished product.
And I think that also contributes to the definition of a mill town. As we spoke about earlier, Webster developing around these mills and becoming so developed and successful. That was because Slater was invested in attracting entire families to come live there for their lives for a long time. He wanted his workforce to be, to have roots in this town that he created. And he wanted it to be appealing to them because he wanted entire families, he wanted the heads of families to decide, I want to move my family to this place to stay. Whereas the Lowell system was more dormitory style, and it was more of a temporary position that you would take, at least at the outset. So this would be a job that if you were a young woman that you would take for a couple years, and then you would, I guess, ultimately use the income that you made and go elsewhere, or you would get married and then go live in your husband's house.
Right. So there were like farm girls who were from the farm, and the father sent them to the mill because they were guaranteed safety, they were guaranteed a job, they were guaranteed a place to live, they were guaranteed a religious sort of structure to their lives. So it was kind of like, give us your girls and we'll take care of them kind of situation with Lowell. Whereas Slater's kind of like, bring your whole family here. There's something for everyone.
Yeah. Well, I think that might be why, for example, Lowell and Waltham they were already urban sort of areas, or much closer to urban areas. So the attraction of, hey, we have this community, we have this infrastructure already built up here, was very different than developing a place like Webster from just farmland. Right. So the mills had less of a hand in developing the entire community, whereas that's something that Slater really emphasized in his mill style.
Exactly. And didn't his brother, John, I think his name was, he goes and builds another mill system in
Slatersville.
Yes, Slatersville, and brings with him the technology of damming the river or the lake in order to create the power to run the mill. And it was nothing. There was nothing there when he got there. And he, again, built this thriving sort of location with a mill and employment. And I saw a documentary about it, and the actual physical design of the dam to create the mill power is the exact same design as what's in England. So he brought that technology also over. So he was like a thief of architectural water relocation kind of systems. And without him, they wouldn't have had this sort of aquatic understanding of water power. So a couple of the brothers came over, but I guess John was the most important to the Slater family in terms of his development, further development.
That's why Slatersville can bill itself as America's first mill village.
It's all really very interesting in terms of the whole family sort of structure, but in creating this dependency in a way with the families and Slater's mill, he employed the first to employ the concept of a company store. And this has become sort of a bad term now. But back then, I'm not sure if it, I don't know if it was in order to take advantage of people, if it was to keep them there, or if it was a good, if it was a benevolence. I'm not sure. But he preferred to hire families, and each member had a different job. But how did the company store put people at a disadvantage? And what is a company store? And how do you depict this in the museum itself?
The company store was one part of the way that the Slater structure ruled people's lives. So they paid rent to his buildings where they lived, for their homes, and then they had to purchase their goods in the Slater store. And he built a Sunday school, so they would go there on Sunday morning. So pretty much every aspect of life was somehow orchestrated or planned by Slater. But you cite some reasons why this might be. I think all of those things are true. It was a combination of all of those things to make sure that all of the people had what they need, and that they could be devoted to the meal, but that they also really could function as a family and be together. So I think elements of all those things. As a tiny aside, the company store still stands in Webster, and it's boarded up, but the building is still there, and it's quite a nice, fairly large building. So it was definitely, and it was situated right across from the mill, right across the street.
Very convenient.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that also this plays into sort of the New English sense of independence. That was one of the, I guess, obstacles of getting families to leave farming, because when you're a farmer, you're very independent economically and like in your community. And I believe part of the idea was that it almost simplified how economics works in a busier environment for these families who are maybe not very educated in finances or in arithmetic or mathematics, by having all the transactions go through Samuel Slater. He definitely had the point of view of kind of being a father to the larger community, whether his employees or other people saw that as something benevolent or as something, maybe taking advantage of people. That, who's to say? There's some parts of history that we just can't know, because the historical record and the people who are writing the records that are still around today have a certain point of view.
Right. Like Slater's biographer is full of Slater baloney that he told his biographer to make the story better. So
right.
From where he grew up and the house he grew up in England and all that stuff, it's all like, no, it's not real.
I think we can characterize it as being very paternalistic.
Yes. But the company store, it was like you got paid. You had a pay envelope, I guess. If we think about it, if you have a family of 4 even, and all 4 people are employed, you think, there's a rich family. They're making a lot of money. But we're talking about pennies a day in some cases, and dangerous work in some cases. So there's injuries, there's problems with that. There's illnesses that come from working in mills that are predominantly mill related, including some cotton tuberculosis kinds of issues with breathing. And so it's not a safe place generally. It is a business that you're involved in. And the company store, so they take the rent out of your pay, and they take the whatever you buy at the company store comes out of your pay. So you may end up with no extra money, but you may not necessarily need the extra money. But still, there's no sense of amassing money because you're using it as you're earning it. So you're indentured to this system because you can't afford to just go, well, I can't do this anymore. I need to go like make money. Like you don't make any money doing this.
Right. It was a different attitude also in some ways. I think the idea of a company store is very, very foreign to us today, but maybe breaking even might have been the better option for some of these families. Again, it's difficult to say because of the gap.
It keeps them employed, doesn't it?
If you're employed and you're able to get all the things you need, maybe that's a better way to do it. But I imagine that it would have been extremely difficult in order to leave.
What about education? Was there any sense of enforcing education up to a certain level, or was it not? We're talking about an era when there was no public education and there was no important sense of education for people to grow up with.
No, public education didn't come into play, at least in Massachusetts, till the early 1840s or so, when children were mandated to go to school for 3 months out of the year. Before that, they did not have to go to school, period. There was some teaching going on, probably in the home, because religion was a strong factor, and you can't read the Bible unless you have some read. But kids did learn the alphabet. They learned how to do some things. We see a lot of stitching. We have samples of that in the museum, and that the girls would learn how to. They practice. They put ABCs and so on, the alphabet on their samplers. So there was some teaching going on, but it wasn't mandated.
It's not like we think of today or even later with the educational laws. It
wasn't mandated here in Massachusetts until 1840s. Right. I'm not sure what it was in Rhode Island. Anyway, I think that all the New England states eventually required some kind of education for the kids who worked in the mill, for the kids who worked on farms. It's just in general.
Yeah, it's another way to better oneself, isn't it?
Yes.
The practices of child labor back then were fairly cruel in what we think of today, with children as young as 6 working long hours under dangerous conditions. Employing young children for their small fingers is now considered the height of exploitation. Children were placed in these positions by families who were desperately in need of an income to survive. And it wasn't until the 1930s that child labor laws were enacted on the federal level. Was the mill system really a choice for men and women and children, or do you think it was one of those cases where people fell into a world where they really couldn't afford to escape?
The statistic, the number, the fact that child labor laws didn't go into effect until the 1930s is always one that has surprised me too. It took so long for that to happen, But in the 19th century, when kids are working in the mills, kids are working in the mines, kids are working on farms, kids were considered to be an economic extension of the family. They were not considered to be separate individuals who needed to be, I don't say coddled is probably the wrong word, but they were expected to participate in the family economic structure. And that was the way it was, no matter what the circumstance, unless, of course, you were rich, in which case you could be idle. But if you weren't rich, then you could not be idle. Being idle was a sin. So there was a great deal of acceptance that kids would work for the home, for the economic benefit of the family. And that worked in quite well into Slater's methodology and structure, didn't it? The family, that everyone would work. But the conditions, it's true, the conditions for kids in the mills were terrible, very, very dangerous. Conditions on the farms were difficult too. Conditions in the mines were bad. It was true. It was just a cultural thing. I don't think there was anything necessarily exceptional about what was going on here than it was everywhere else too. This was common because of the way the general approach to the family economic unit as a whole.
Textile mills and all sorts of other mills were among the most dangerous jobs. People were frequently getting hurt. There was no protections in place for workers. There's no such thing as OSHA
Or unions.
or unions. And I think part of that, there was also maybe this idea of if you get hurt, it's your fault. Like that's the consequences of something that you've done by not doing your job properly, instead of it being more of an employer's responsibility, moral job to ensure that mistakes don't happen. But even injuries aside, if you go through your working career in a mill without getting injured, like breaking your arm or getting a cut or something like that, there was still pretty severe consequences to just being in that environment for so long. Many mill workers would lose their hearing because it was so loud. As you said earlier, the kind of cotton textile tuberculosis, it's what they call brown lung. It would be very similar to what coal miners would have from working in the mines, black lung. So they would have all sorts of respiratory issues after just a lifetime of working conditions that were unsafe.
The kiss of death from the shuttles, where they had to suck the thread through in order to reboot the shuttle once they changed shuttles, and sucking in that cotton thread could cause these issues.
And as innovation happens, as the machinery gets more advanced, gets faster, is made with metal instead of wood, as these advancements happen, the machinery is just getting more and more dangerous. But the workforce was much slower to adapt to that, I think.
There was a hierarchy of the workforce too, eventually, where there were certain jobs that paid more because it was more specialized and skilled than the kids' kinds of jobs that they had, which was running around and using their little fingers to fix things quickly. And everybody's barefoot, and everybody's working as fast and as hard as they could for something like 6 days a week and over 10 hours a day. And when the 10-hour work laws came into effect much later in the 19th century, they weren't enforced. They would sort of fake it, and then the inspectors would come around and, oh yeah, look, they're going home now. And it was a lie.
You put on a good show.
They put on a show for the inspectors. So it would take a disaster for any kind of attention to workplace safety or to fire safety or to... Everybody was sort of expendable in the greater glory of making textiles, which is kind of very foreign to us today.
And I believe it was in the 19 teens, I believe, when the Triangle Shirtwaist factory disaster happened. And that disaster is really what started true development and organization for establishing worker safety.
In Fall River in 1874, there was the Granite Mill fire, and people were stuck on the 5th and a half floor, and mostly women and children, on a Saturday, and they had to jump from that in order to escape because there were no fire escapes, and the fire department's ladders didn't reach that far, and they didn't know that there was a fire that had come up from underneath because no one could reach them to tell them there was a fire coming. So quite a few people died, which is like one of the few fires in Fall River, who's had hundreds of fires in its life, that actually people died in. And again, it changed the laws in Massachusetts about fire safety and having 2 entrances and exits, and those kinds of laws got changed, including fire suppression ability right away, instead of mostly relying on the fire department, which may or may not hear the signal. So yeah, it takes a disaster to create some kind of change still There's nothing new about that. But these poor people, I just feel horrible that these
Yeah.
kids had to they had no childhood. They had no. So Slater's building houses for people and putting them in it and having them charge rent. And then in Fall River, there's a little bit of that going on, but mainly for the more skilled workers that they're bringing over from England eventually to come work in the mills because they know how to do things that other people can't. But in Fall River, mill system was more laissez-faire, which is you're on your own to find a place to live. You're on your own or you're on your own to take care of your own abode. So these people lived in squalor with outhouses that were horrific and unkept, and so there was nobody took care of anybody from the mills. You were really on your own. So you had to go to work, and there was the mill bell or the whistle, and you had to go to work every day. But you went home to quite horrific conditions. That doesn't sound like the case with Slater at all. It sounds like it was important to him that people have a home, correct?
Yes. This is kind of an aside, I guess, but another transition that has been going on all during this time is that people used to make their living from what they did with their hands, skilled laborers and so on. And this transition to being paid for your time instead was a huge change in our economic structures. And that's what you're describing now in Fall River, that people had no choices anymore. They were not dependent on their own handiwork. They had to find a job where they were paid. And that caused so many perturbations, the strikes that I think result from that, and the attempts to reduce wages, and then, like I say, reduce working hours. And instead of just accepting that, the mill owners would just speed up the machine so the production would stay the same. So all those things were part of the function of having now being paid labor, being paid for your time instead of being paid for your output or your what you created with your hands or grew.
Yes,
or made, but in some way made.
Piecework.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a higher percentage of unskilled labor. But something that I found interesting when researching Slater is that Slater was only involved directly in 13 different mills. But one of the things that we learn sort of earlier on in the museum is that he had an effect on hundreds of mills throughout New England. Like, he had a very extensive reach throughout the whole region. So there comes the question of how is that possible? And that comes from a practice that he had in his mills where this was for middle or upper class boys, they would be trained as engineers, and they would be trained in the more technical aspects of the machinery. So they would get skilled labor, and their position would be much different from the kids working in the mill itself. So that was unskilled labor. That was just a position that you held because your family worked in the mill. Whereas these more upper class boys would learn the skilled labor aspects of how to run the mill. And then they would be able to then travel elsewhere in the region and start their own mills. So that is how his designs really spread so far.
So he created his own apprenticeship program, in a sense, from his own experiences of being an apprentice, and treated them well so that they didn't run away and steal everything like he did.
Right. Well, I guess at that point, the technology was already here.
Right. Well,
he already let the cat out of the bag.
The cat was out of the bag, but it kept being developed and enhanced and enlarged, and the cotton gin and things assisted in the production. The downfall of Fall River was it never reinvested in its own technology. It just took the money and ran, and it didn't really make it like higher tech or higher or more well done. They didn't let's get rid of these old looms and bring in the new looms. That there wasn't a reinvestment into the corporation because they were making plenty of bucks. So then the South figured out air conditioning. So there you go with that. That's the end of that. They're gonna grow the cotton, harvest the cotton, and do it all down there because now they can work in the summer. In our last podcast, we spoke to author and historian Bruce Dorsey about his book Murder in a Mill Town on the death of Sarah Cornell, who was a mill worker who came from the Lowell system but ended her life working in the Fall River mill system, which in many ways was the opposite of the Lowell system. He spoke to us about the opportunities as well as the dangers of women working in the mills. Being the first generation of women in America to actually do so. So how do you think this opportunity for some sort of financial independence worked both ways for women? In other words, on the whole, was it a good thing or a bad thing for the women to work in a cotton manufacturing mill?
In the case of Lowell, the Lowell girls, as they were called, that seemed to be a positive that they were able to find a job. It gave them some economic independence.
But they sent the money back home, right? They would make the money but send it back to the farm so that their family could maintain their status quo without their labor on the farm. So the girls get sent to Lowell and they start working and they make money and they send it back. A lot of it, I'd say, right? So they're not necessarily independent, but they're certainly on their own making money.
The independence is in being apart from the family and being with other young women and seeing an urban lifestyle and just becoming more educated in the life larger than what there was on the farm.
But the temptations were huge at that point, right? For these women to go, oh, this is what the big city's like. I think I like this a lot better,
Well, their dormitories were run by like these matrons,
right,
who had a pretty strong grip on the girls who lived there, and were really like essentially their job was the moral purity of the people who lived in their dormitory.
And we're talking about girls going through puberty, so that's hard to handle and hard to manage with a dormitory full of girls that are 15, 16, and 17 years old.
Ultimately, I think that any kind of financial independence that a woman can gain is a good thing. For a variety of reasons. Is the job of working in the mill itself, was that the conditions of that job obviously were not good. So it's one of those things it's both a good thing and maybe a bad thing. Or what does the bad conditions of working in a mill cancel out sort of the good gained from being able to support yourself independently, especially if at the time, if you were a single woman for whatever reason, like if your husband had died, or if you were trying to support a family as a single mother.
Well, in the Lowell system, you couldn't have kids, you couldn't be married, you had to be a single young girl who was strictly maintained within this functioning mill system. And I don't know, don't you get rebellious around that age? Don't you start saying, oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to come in at 9 o'clock at night, or I don't want to, oh, the sun's going down, time to party. There's a human factor, I think, that is missing from the equation that is not being considered, that everybody's going to be strictly religious and strictly obedient and strictly subservient to the system in which they're employed by. I think that there was a whole lot of stuff going on beyond that. And Sarah Cornell proves it. She was one of those people who was like, I can't do this. This is too strict. Her mind was that it was too strict. And so she went from mill to mill to mill because it wasn't freedom for her. It was the opposite of freedom for her. And I imagine she's just one of a whole plethora of people that felt that way. So my whole point is, you could say it can be both good and bad. But if we look at it from a modern understanding, don't we really go, that's really bad? Like the whole thing is really bad. If we think of it from, 2025, that's a really bad life. Because there's so much more opportunity now, of course. And so we have this, bigger understanding of how to make money and the kinds of jobs that are better for us than this. I mean, you could be a school teacher, right, at some point, but you had to be single if you were female. You couldn't be a nurse in a hospital and be married. I mean, there were certain kinds of rules about women's existence. And the Lowell system and the Slater system and the Fall River system really imposed strict societal cultural norms on women in general as to how to behave, how to act, how to work, what you get out of it. And they sort of belonged to the system in which they worked. And it more so than the men, I think. I don't feel that they had the freedom to kind of change their vocation or lot in life. They were stuck. And it's the stuck part that bothers me. And that's why I say it's not necessarily a good thing. Yep.
Do you think that has changed so much around the world? Or, I mean, some of those things have changed here, but I'm thinking of parts of the world where women are sitting all day at sewing machines sewing on clothes. And
you're absolutely right.
Those same things are still going on today.
We consider those third world countries, though. We don't consider them modern democracies who are thinking about workers' rights. We don't think of that. And now a lot of our manufacturing is done by places like that. So I totally understand that. Like we farmed it out to the same systems that we decry in our own country. That's America. That's what we do, but other countries do it too. So it's not just us. But yes, the slave mentality or the indentured part of it, or women sitting there all day, just for 15 hours a day doing the same thing over and over again. That's not in our country, but we pay them nothing in order to do that, in order to get our clothes, in order to get our shoes, in order to get our goods. So it does exist, yes, absolutely, and it's horrific. And we benefit from their slavery. But this was all us at one point. We were like this. And it finally went away, but it took so much. So there must have been wrong in the beginning for it to change, if you think about it. Or else it would stay the same if it was okay. If it was free choice.
Well, yeah, there are some things that changed, but there's still some attitudes that still remain the same. So the manifestation may have changed, but the underlying thinking is still there. And there's women are still, if you will, certain expectations are set for women, how they will act, how they'll behave, how they will look, and what they do. That hasn't changed. The forms are different, but there's still a set of expectations if you're talking about the boys versus the girls.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I like Nicole. She's a younger generation, so she may speak to this, but I just see, even today, I just see like a lot of retrograde thinking.
Yes.
Going on in this country, and just bringing awareness back to what is going on all around the world and how we fit into that, and what we've accomplished, but then again what we've not accomplished. And I know I'm being a little obtuse here, but
you're not being obtuse, because we're trying to be fair, and we're trying to be sort of politically neutral, and that's fine. I think that's important for this discussion, that it's not a political issue. It is a human rights kind of situation, and it's a women's sort of understanding of their own manifest destiny.
And those things, human rights, are very closely tied to economic situations,
isn't it? Though, yes, in fact, it entirely is.
So that's why you asked the question, and that's why.
No, I value what you're trying to say and how you're saying it. So no, I respect your answers.
All right, your turn, Nicole.
So one of the first things that they tell you when you're studying history is that you cannot judge a historical period through the lens of today's attitudes or morals in terms
Do you
of,
think that's fair?
I don't know. I think the value in history is that by learning about, in particular, the struggle of workers' rights and of women's rights in this country and the progression between maybe oppressive systems of work and economic conditions and expectations put on women, and sort of we saw how slow it was to change in this country, and thinking about how these conditions still exist in other parts of the world, that just goes to show how much more work we still have to do.
Right.
And are there lessons in what happened here that can be applied to other places? Or how are the practices, either the economic structures of what our businesses are contributing to unsafe or exploitative working conditions in other places of the world? What can we do to combat that? And how can we continue to improve by learning from history?
But how much of what we're talking about is men telling women what the way it is? And so that's always wrong. Whether it's accepted or whether it was done back then is another question. But
Right.
to brainwash an entire population to say, I'm your savior, I'm your employer, I'm, your way out of whatever life that you drudgingly live right now. And then you buy into it because you're brainwashed into it, aren't you? And then you like, wait, what? And it does take generations for people to break away from those precepts and those understandings and cultural norms of the time to go, wait, that's not right. But the thing is, it was always not right. That's my point. My point is it's always not right. But it was a system that worked at the time. It did work. It did function. But who benefited? The mill owners, not the workers.
Right.
Always. That's always true.
And who is behind the historical record?
Right.
Who are we not hearing from? Who we don't have any idea of the real conditions or the point of view of some of these people silenced by history just because nothing has survived.
Right. There's diaries and letters, mainly letters, I think, where people wrote home from their mill experiences, from being in Lowell and things like that, or family letters that have surfaced that tell us a bit about the daily grind of a life.
Yeah. But the farther you go back, the harder it is to find those letters.
Yes,
or
right.
Maybe, who knows, if things get lost and things get damaged. That's why museums and archives are so important for keeping those things safe and stewarding them. So
exactly, back to the Samuel Slater experience.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to understand what it was like in order to get an understanding of the history of your area and of the United States. I mean, it's ugly sometimes, and it's exploitive, and it's dark, and it's also people's lives. So there's a massive truth in the story that you tell that is as important as anything else, whether it's got good positive qualities or not. It's the truth of the time, and that's the Samuel Slater experience, actually, from his coming over to the development of his system, which is amazing to me. It's amazing to me that you straddle that in your museum in a way that makes it an entertaining experience, an entertaining educational experience. And the 19th century doesn't sound fun to me, as you can tell. I'm like not a 19th century person, especially if you're lower middle class or working class. Like, no, I wouldn't think that would be fun. You were just the great unwashed, and that, nobody knew who you were and you lived and died. But it did inspire the birth of unions and manufacturing organizations and guilds and workers' right. Now, a person visiting your museum can feel and see this era. Would either of you want to live back then? And if so, why?
Can I back up for just a moment?
You
I
certainly
wanted to
can.
give you an illustration of this kind of wraps it up, I think, for the kids who visit the museum.
Right.
When one boy in particular said something to me, which I keep retelling because I think it shows a grasp of what he's seeing, and relative to working in the mills to today. And he was on a school field trip, and he said, in all seriousness, he said, "I'd rather do homework."
Really?
Uh-huh.
Oh, then work in a mill.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah, so I think he understood that this was not a pleasant way of life, and he said, I'd rather do homework.
Yeah.
So I
That's
think
for sure. I'd rather
and
do anything than do that.
and another one that and this relates to what we were just talking about, or how history and what's recorded and what's not. And there was another old boy, and all these kids are like 12, 11, 10, 11, 12 years old usually, that come, and he's looking at at the pictures that we have, giant enlarged images of mill scenes, kids
Right.
in mills, and he said, well, where are the black boys?
Mm-hmm.
So, and now there probably weren't any black families in Webster at the time, or in Lowell, or there may have been, but his consciousness was, well, okay, but where's my history? So we can say, well, maybe they weren't working in the textile mills, but they were working in the mines, and they were working on the cotton fields, or they were doing work also. They all were, but I just thought that his question was interesting, and that he was thinking about where does he fit in our history.
That reminds me of another incident. I believe it was a group tour or an adult tour that we had through the museum. And while looking at a lot of those photographs that we have of the children working in the mills, of the mill worker community, the response to those photos was, did that girl in the photo ever see this photograph?
Mm.
And this was at a time when photography was still developing. Cameras and photographs were not as pervasive as they are today.
Well, plus
there might have been a really high chance that this girl never saw this photograph that was taken of her.
Lewis Hine was taking them for the government so that he could document the children in the workforce, which led to the child labor laws in the 30s. So he was doing a documentarian's job of having, and it was the photographs of these kids in the mills that changed everything, because you could see with your own eyes instead of try to somebody tell you, oh, kids are working in the mills. Well, what does that mean? Oh, sounds good. Sounds like fun. Sounds like everybody's having a good old time. And then you see them, and you see these massive rooms with these massive amounts of machinery and these little kids everywhere, and you're like, what? So yeah, that's a poignant story that you tell, with the child wondering if she had seen her photo.
I think it even illustrates how bad the conditions were, because if you have no idea how the textile mills work, what it's like inside of a mill, but you grow up in a time when work is seen as something virtuous and as good, and that when someone says to you, oh, the kids are working in the mill, you're like, oh, the kids are doing their part to support their family. That's a good thing. They're working, but not realize how horrible the conditions actually were and what it was actually like to be in that environment. It's the power of photography.
Yes, it really is. It really is. So do you use some of the Hine photography in your museum? Lewis Hine? Yeah, that stuff.
And we sell his book there too.
Oh, great. Because it changed the world. It changed the United States. Let's put it that way. It didn't change the world at all. Well, so you want to live in the 19th century, Nicole?
I would like at least to visit. Like, I feel like
you want to time travel.
I can't be presented with the possibility of the ability to go back in time and not take it. I think I would like to visit at least for a little while, but I don't think I would like to live there forever.
No, it sounds pretty dismal to me. It's like,
yeah, it sounds bad.
It does sound bad.
But that would be...
Unless you're very wealthy and can be...
Right, unless you have a lot of money.
Yes.
Then...
But that's the way it is today. Unless you have a lot of money. I don't know. You know,
doesn't mean you're immune from disaster.
No, and health issues too. Yeah.
Right.
So, Barbara, do you want to live in the 19th century?
I might entertain a visit to the travel machine, but absolutely not.
Yeah.
Nicole and I both have the opportunity to talk about what kids experienced then.
Right.
Every day. And so there's a reconstructed mill section in the museum, and the floor there vibrates, and you can hear noises. And we talk about some of the things that we've talked about, like the fact that there's a lot of cotton fiber in the air that kids are breathing. But one of the things that we don't see right away is that something you can imagine, because we have mill buildings all over the state, all along our rivers. There are mill buildings, many of them repurposed in a good way, but they're there. And so if you look at these buildings, they have big windows, and those windows let in light because there was no electricity initially, but they could never be opened. They would never be opened. So imagine yourself in the middle of summer, being in a mill from dawn till dusk, no way, there's no ventilation, nothing. And the reasons they want to keep the humidity inside the building, because the humidity keeps the fiber down. So imagine, it must have been stifling in there. Horrible, just horrible conditions. Not to mention also the noise and the effort to breathe. It was like being in an oven.
Mm.
So
I wouldn't even want to be a woman back then, just generally.
There
would be no Barbara in charge of a museum back then, that's for sure.
No, but it was pretty horrific. So my answer is, would I like to be back then there? No.
I'd like to take a peek as well, Nicole. I would like to just look in and then leave, but I can imagine how horrible it is. I can just... I don't know. I just think that it would be an eye-opener for a lot of people, and it would be really good if some people were sent back to the 19th century so they could see what it was really like and how far we've come in America in some ways, and then how regressive we are in other ways. That you don't want that again.
Well, it's almost like going on vacation somewhere else, whether it's domestically or abroad to a different country. The experience of going on vacation somewhere is very different than living there for anywhere you go.
True.
So that would still be going on vacation almost to the past, would be very different than like having to live there and work there.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, very good point. Well, I really want to thank you both for this conversation. It's been most enlightening and most interesting, and I hope that our listeners are also as intrigued as I am about the Samuel Slater experience, and will pay a visit to your great place. And what days are you open?
We are open we're open to the public every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
Perfect.
Check our hours, and sometimes extra days, like we were open Monday on Patriots Day, so we do try to make provision for school vacation and such. But check the website.
Excellent.
So tell you the exact hours. But not only that we have our open days, but we are open for visits from groups and schools every day of the week.
Oh, cool. Okay, that's important to know. That's excellent. Well, I really, really thank you, and I hope we meet in person soon. And thank you very much for your contributions to this podcast today.
Very welcome.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, I hope you get a chance to come visit soon.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Thank you for listening to the Lizzie Borden Podcast, episode 36. We've been speaking with Barbara Van Reed, who is the Executive Director of the Samuel Slater Experience, and Nicole Gaudette, the museum's Program Coordinator. Find Richard Barron's Lizzie Borden Girl Detective Stories at Amazon.com and at LizzieBordenGirlDetective.com, where you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Listen to more Lizzie Borden podcasts on our website or on Podbean, Audible, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and YouTube. Please support this podcast through a subscription on Patreon. Thank you.